In this video, I will introduce you to statutes as a form of binding legal authority. You know the old saying, there ought to be a law. Remember before you came to law school, you thought the law was a legislative enactment, a statute, a law. Then you came to law school and you learned about the common law. Common law is sometimes called dog law. You don't articulate a rule to your dog. Lucky, don't sit on the sofa. You wait until something happens. Lucky sits on the sofa, and then you say, bad dog. Common law is like that. After something happens, parties go to court, and then they find out who was the bad dog, and now the rest of us know for the future not to do that. But it wasn't explicitly stated before the first dog sat on the sofa, the way a statute says a rule before anyone does anything. Now here's a little secret. In law school, especially in the first year, you basically read cases, but the modern day practice of law, there aren't that many purely common law issues. Your LRR&W professors work hard to develop research and writing problems that are common law based so you can learn case synthesis and writing without having the added complications of statutory interpretation in some of your problems. But most of today's legal practice is very heavily involved with the application of statutes. Even purely common law causes of action can be limited by statutes of limitations. And a lot of today's legal work also involves the application of delegated legislation, which is known as regulations. But today we're looking at statutes, so I've brought a picture of my favorite law, Public Law 101-143, National Tap Dance Day. So this is what a statute looks like. It's an enactment of Congress signed by the President, and it's the law. They're called public laws because they are laws that affect everyone. There are actually some laws that affect specific individuals, and they're called private laws. Public Law 101-143 means it's the 143rd public law enacted in the 101st Congress, and is published as a session law, which is the chronological publication of all the public laws from one legislative session. Federal session laws are published in Statutes at Large, and you can see in the upper left-hand corner that this particular law is published on page 838 of volume 103 of Statutes at Large. Here's a different law that operates a little differently. It's the 1938 law that established that November 11th will be the federal legal holiday known as Armistice Day. In 1943, public laws were known by their chapter numbers, but this is still a public law, like National Tap Dance Day. And then in 1954, another public law renamed it Veterans Day. And in 1968, lots of federal holidays were moved to Mondays to give us those nice 3-day weekends. And Veterans Day was moved to the 4th Monday in October. A lot of veterans were unhappy with that, and they wrote to their congressman and protested. And in 1975, Veterans Day was moved back to November 11th with this act. So these statutes are acts, but session laws are not a very convenient way to look at laws. Laws that have changed over time, like the Veterans Day holiday, are also available in a much more convenient form called a code. The code is the topical arrangement of permanent general laws in force at the time of its publication. Laws like National Tap Dance Day, which was actually just a one-time event, are only available in session law form, but laws of lasting application appear in the code. This is the section of the U.S. Code that includes Veterans Day. This section actually has all the federal legal holidays, so years later, when Martin Luther King Jr. Day was added as a federal holiday, it was placed in this section as well. The code is divided into broad parts called titles, broad topics called titles, and then these titles are divided into parts and then subparts and chapters and sometimes subchapters and eventually sections. And when you cite to the U.S. Code, you mention only the title and section numbers. And also you add the edition of the code you're looking at. Since the law will change over time, you want people to know which version of the code you were looking at. For example, if you were looking at a 1972 edition of the U.S. Code, Veterans Day would be on the 4th Monday in October. Now, I'm pretty sure that you all can guess that you can search for statutes on Westlaw and Lexis, but there's some other methods of finding relevant statutes that are sometimes easier than looking through your search results. For example, you can use the organization of the code itself to find relevant statutes using the table of contents. First, you choose the correct title, which in this case is Title V, Government Organization and Employees. Part 3 of that is Employees. Subpart E is Attendance and Leave. And then within that subpart, you see that Chapter 61 is hours of work, and Subchapter 1 has the general provisions, and you look through the sections and you see, why, yes, 6103 is holidays. Now, even if you didn't come to a statute through the table of contents, it's always a good idea to look at the table of contents for the chapter or subchapter that any section you are interested in is a part of, because frequently sections must be read together with other sections in order to find relevant information to help you understand the statute. For example, sections 6104 and 6124 actually are limitations on holidays for different types of workers, people on flexible schedules or hourly workers. And then there's some more general sections that apply to all things involving hours of work for attendance and leave federal employees. For example, 6101, which is the 6120, which is purpose, and 6121, which are definitions. Another way it's sometimes easier to find a relevant section is through a code index. Index can be printed in books, but there are also online indexes to codes that make it easier to find relevant sections quickly. By looking in the index under the heading Veterans Day Date, I quickly found the Title 5 and section number 6103, where we can find the Veterans Day holiday. Now, federal statutes are on Lexis and Westlaw, but they're also available for free from the U.S. government printing office. Both the U.S. Code and also actually the statutes at large, session laws, are available here at the GPO FedSys website. And you can find statutes for free from the Office of the Law Revision Council. These are the actual people who take the session laws and turn them into a code. So this version of the code is very, very up to date. But finding relevant statutes is only half the battle, because the statute means what it says, but even more than that, it means what an authoritative court says it means. So finding the relevant statute is just the first step in statutory research. Now you need to find cases that interpret relevant portions of the statute. This is made easier through something called annotated codes. Annotated codes are codes that include the statutory language and much more. The extra thing I want to focus on now is something called annotations, or notes of decisions. And to show you how they work, I'm going to jump from these federal statutes to state law. Well, actually, mythical state law. But before we get there, state statutes are published in much the same manner as federal statutes. Each state has its own session laws and statutory code. Sometimes the terminology is different. The federal code is divided into titles. Some state codes are also divided into titles, but some are divided into chapters or articles. And some even have codes that have descriptive names like civil code and penal code rather than numbers. This is an example of a burglary statute from the mythical jurisdiction of Grimes. Its code section is Grimes General Laws, Chapter 266, Section 14. It's a simple little statute of one sentence. At the bottom are references to the Grimes session laws that enacted and amended this section. And to fully understand the section, you may need to read other sections of the Grimes General Laws. For example, there might be a section that defines the term felony. The other thing you're going to want to look at is case law. And this is where the annotated codes really pay off, whether you use them in print or on your favorite legal research system, because annotated codes provide references to cases that interpret various provisions of the statute. For example, if we wanted to ascertain whether or not a particular structure qualifies as a dwelling house for purposes of the burglary statute, we can use this annotated code to find cases that have addressed that issue for this statute. In addition, cases can rule that a law is unconstitutional. How many of you realize that there is a death penalty statute on the books in Massachusetts? This is the free version of the Massachusetts Code operated by the Massachusetts Legislature. General Laws, Chapter 265, Section 2, establishes a death penalty for premeditated or extremely cruel murder. But the Supreme Judicial Court found that the death penalty, at least as applied, violates the Massachusetts Constitution and so is invalid. And there was no indication that this statute was held unconstitutional on the Massachusetts General Laws website. So when you're using a statute, it's not enough to read the words of the statute itself. You want to still find interpretive cases using an annotated code or a full-text search or a digest search or a combination of those three. And you'll also want to check with some tool that checks for statutory validity, like Westlaw's Key Site, or Shepard's, which you can get on Lexis or in books, to make sure the statute can be applied as it's written. And that's our introduction to statutory research.